Canada is trapped in a military and political crossroads as rarely in its recent history. The decision to acquire 88 F-35 fighters, taken in 2022, seemed at the time a pragmatic measure, almost inevitable, to replace the old CF-188 Hornet models operating for over 35 years. But now, what was a strategic choice has become an invisible imprisonment, where any movement in the opposite direction can represent isolation, distrust, and even a complete weakening of its position on the global board. The situation of the Canadian Air Force borders on the collapse. The average age of their fighters exceeds 38 years. Hangars are increasingly empty of trained personnel, and maintenance has become a logistical puzzle. The northern north of the country, gateway to the Arctic, is vulnerable as never before. And even if voices arise that there are alternatives to F-35, technological and diplomatic reality says otherwise. Canada can no longer simply leave this play without serious consequences. Historically, the country has always had an ambiguous relationship with the United States. On the one hand, they have been strategic partners for decades with NATO and NORAD ties, the Joint Aerospace Defense Command. On the other hand, there is a constant attempt to maintain some autonomy, to avoid Washington's political shadow. However, in times of growth in global tension, especially with Donald Trump's return to the American presidency, this attempt to maintain distance sounds more as hesitation than independence. Trump has already made it clear that he will not tolerate allies who do not proportionately invest in collective security. Not only does it threaten to cut access to privileged information, but it can also exclude Canada from joint operations and key decisions on the Western axis of defense. This is the new rule of the game, and not fully adhering to it can cost much more than a few billions in fighters. The problem is that, internally, Canada is experiencing political turbulence that hinders any attempt at firm action. The new government, led by Marcus Delaney, a figure who arouses more doubts than certainty, tries to balance himself between a progressive discourse and the brutal demands of an increasingly bellicoso world. Parliament is fragmented. Traditional parties have lost ground, and small ideological groups now have disproportionate influence. Meanwhile, the threats don't expect. Russia has often tests air surveillance in the Arctic. China, in turn, invests heavily on naval north routes and develops military technology capable of unbalanced any alliance. Delaney came to power promising a general review of defense spending. He spoke of local innovation, betting on the Canadian industry and reviewing delivery schedules. But every attentive Canadian knows how this ends, with postponements, disguised cuts of tax prudence, and, in the end, the abandonment of crucial international commitments. We have seen this movie before. The problem is that this time the scenario is different. The world no longer tolerates. Modern combat systems are interconnected. Actions are coordinated in seconds, and interoperability has become a basic condition for any relevant military operation. This is why the F-35 is not just another plane. It is the backbone of the new Western air doctrine. The integrated sensor system, real-time data sharing, and advanced stealth turn this fighter into a flying hub. Countries that do not operate this model are, in a practical way, excluded from the most sensitive and strategic missions. Gripen, promoted by ancient Canadian governments as a more independent alternative, has no half of this capacity. And worse, it depends on several components manufactured under American control. That is, the illusion of sovereignty with the Gripen is, in practice, an exchange of 6 for half a dozen, but without the benefits of real integration with the Allies. In addition, any retreat would now bring almost irreparable damage to Canada's international credibility. It would be a clear sign that the country does not take its commitments seriously. And at a time when Allies' confidence is worth more than ever, that would be a fatal mistake. Current geopolitics is no longer governed by rhetoric, but by the concrete ability to deter the threats. And, or not, it involves weapons, cutting-edge technology, and solid military alliances. In short, the F-35 is much more than a fighter. He is an entry ticket to the nation's club that really decides the course of the world. With the contract in force and the first payments ever processed, the Canadian government is now in a situation where it is not only politically unfeasible, it is, above all, militarily dangerous. The F-35 is no longer just a state-of-the-art fighter to turn into the link that anchors Canada to an increasingly dependent alliance system of interoperability and technological integration. This is not nationalism or diplomatic whim. It is about ensuring that when a real crisis knocks on the door, the country is not isolated with obsolete equipment and empty promises. The F-35 works, in practice, as the password for the closed club of Western powers, and being out of it would mean more than being left behind. It would mean to be left out. The problem is that, internally, this discussion is lost between discourses about austerity, sovereignty, and technological autonomy. These terms sound well in parliamentary stands and discourses, but lose strength in the face of technical and geostrategic reality. Canada Air Force today faces operational exhaustion. It is not just that the CF-18 have passed their life, that many of them are in such precarious conditions that they do not even take off without a complex, expensive, and risky logistics scheme. There are reports of pilots flying at aircraft with partially functional systems, and the availability rate of these units is frighteningly low, around 35%. That is, 2 in 3 fighters are out of operation any day of the week. This in a world where the time to respond to threats is measured in minutes. In addition, there is the human factor. The number of trained pilots has fallen dramatically in the last 5 years. Forming a hunting pilot is not something that resolves with newspaper ads. It is a long, expensive, and harder process to maintain, especially when the equipment they should operate is old-fashioned and unusual. Young officers look for other careers or simply choose not to renew contracts. Demotivation in the Canadian military air sector is a time bomb about to burst. It is not enough to buy the best hunt, you must have those who pilot, who keeps it, who understands it. And in the midst of all this, the Arctic, Canada's strategic jewel, is becoming an increasingly congested geopolitical chess. Russia has tested the limits of U.S. defense several times in the far north, and China, with its impressive naval production capacity, began to study seriously polar routes for trade and military presence. Canada cannot afford to stay behind. Each second of delay in modernizing your air force is an invitation to test, provocation, and eventually the silent invasion of its influence zone. It is in this context that the dependence of the F-35 cannot be viewed as a burden, but as an imperative. There is no concrete alternative at this time that offers the same level of tactical integration, stealth capacities, merger sensors, and compatibility with NATO communication systems. Some politicians still suggest Gripen or even Eurofighter Typhoon, but the truth is that these aircraft, although technically competent, are previous generations platforms and do not dialogue with the digital ecosystem that the F-35 offers. American fighter is, in practice, an extension of the U.S. cyber and intelligence networks of the United States, and being out of it is like operating a computer without internet connection, functional perhaps, but completely isolated. If the new government chooses to follow the evasive way, as is drawn in some recent statements, the answer will come quickly, not just the U.S. Department of Defense. NATO's own system tends to marginalize countries that do not accompany technological advances. There are already previous examples of this. In joint exercises, allies that did not have American standard-compatible systems were relegated to supporting functions or excluded from certain phases of training. In peacetime, this just looks like a detail. But in a real crisis situation, this exclusion can be the difference between survival and collapse. And this is where the debate needs to go up. It's not about buying an expensive plane, but buying a ticket for the future of the defense. The F-35 is not just an attack vector. It is a network-centered platform, capable of connecting air, terrestrial, and naval forces in the same command mesh. He sees further, shares data in real time, and allows coordinated actions with previously unimaginable accuracy. If Canada abdicates, it not only loses in military power, but loses voice. The voice that still has in the safety decisions of the North Atlantic. The voice that allows you to participate in joint decisions, resource allocation priorities, and the definition of common threats. And now, let's take a break here. I want to ask you something straightforward and without winding. What would you do if you were responsible for your country's security and had to choose between maintaining a political promise or ensuring the defense of your home, your family, your territory? Reducing the number of commissioned fighters from 88 to around 60 units may even seem like an elegant political solution. A way to show caution with public spending, or to demonstrate strategic review of the purchase. But the truth behind it is less sophisticated and much more worrying. This type of cut sends a clear message to the rest of the world: Canada is not totally committed to its own defense. This gesture would not go unnoticed by Washington, much less by Brussels or the watchful eyes of Moscow and Beijing. Because in international politics, especially when it comes to defense, hesitation is perceived as weakness. And weakness invites pressure. If the nearest allies begin to doubt Canadian disposition to maintain their obligations within NATO, the domino effect will be inevitable. Loss of influence, less access to joint operations, less shared intelligence, and a growing distance from global military decision centers. Worst of all is that in this game there is no room for calculation errors. It is not like adjusting taxes or reviewing environmental policies. In defense, a wrong decision may not give a second chance. The Arctic is becoming a critical zone, and Canada, as the Arctic country, is being observed with expectation and distrust. Russia is positioning advanced weaponry on its Arctic bases, creating surveillance routes and exercising pressures on waters that were traditionally neutral. China, even without polar tradition, has invested in ice naval technology and logistics infrastructure to project its influence on the region in the next 20 years. To neglect this movement is to allow the Canadian backyard itself to be redesigned by foreign powers. And that's not all. The modernization of the air forces around the world is happening stride. Smaller countries, such as Finland and Switzerland, are already acquiring the F-35. This makes Canada's hesitation even harder to explain. As one of the largest economies of G7, with vast territory and relevant strategic interests, the country should be at the forefront of this transition, and not hesitating each curve. The argument that the F-35 is expensive loses strength when you observe the cost of not having it. Dependence on old aircraft is not cheap. It requires constant maintenance, rare and expensive spare parts, staff training for outdated systems, and, most worrying, high risk of accidents. Each time a CF-18 takes off, he takes not only a pilot, but the hope that that routine mission will not end in tragedy by mechanical failure. It is an unsustainable scenario. And here is the key to the question. The choice of F-35 is no longer a choice. It is a mandatory response to the requirements of the present. Canada doesn't just need new fighters. It needs a renewal of the strategic mindset, a renewed awareness of the role it plays on the global board. And this change begins by understanding that national security is not an expense. It is an investment, perhaps the most important of all. The new government led by Mark Carney has a rare opportunity in his hands. Redefine the course of Canadian defense policy with courage and vision. It can be remembered as the cabinet that strengthened the country at a crucial time, or as another administration that preferred to balance numbers on spreadsheets while the real world prepared for new conflicts. And you, who has come here, what do you think about all this? Did this video bring you a different view? Did you see the purchase of F-35 with other eyes? Or do you still believe there are better alternatives, even with all the risks involved?